thank you for the opportunity to address this important tribunal today. And I want to recognise, because I'm speaking as a Member of Parliament, I want to recognise the role that Jeremy Corbyn MP has played in bringing this important tribunal together. Over the decades, there have been many voices in Parliament for the people of Palestine and for justice for the Palestinian people, but nobody, past or present, has done more for the people of Palestine in the British Parliament than Jeremy Corbyn, and I want to put that on record. I want to briefly look at three things in my evidence. Firstly, the special hearings that we organised in Parliament into Israeli war crimes. Secondly, the political complicity of UK governments in Israel's war. And thirdly, the double standards of the UK government in its treatment of the Israeli war crimes and those by Russia in Ukraine. So, firstly, in May 2024, I went to The Hague with my colleague Imran Hussain MP to meet the team of the Chief Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court and to deliver to the team a dossier of evidence of Israeli war crimes. The dossier followed a series of parliamentary hearings that we organised, attended by 70 parliamentarians from 8 parties in the spring of 2024. Our dossier was based on hours of transcripts from the evidence sessions, as well as written submissions from leading groups, including Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Reporters Without Borders, United Nations Special Rapporteur, eyewitness accounts from a British doctor volunteering in a Gaza hospital, and UK humanitarian organisations with their presence on the ground in Gaza, who did not wish to be named for security reasons, as well as evidence from lawyers and academics. Now, the dossier found widespread international law violations under 4 categories of war crimes. Collective punishment, including starvation as a weapon of war. The forced transfer of the civilian population. Attacks on medical facilities and personnel. Indiscriminate attacks on civilians, including on journalists. What we heard was horrifying. And what the MPs there heard, they'll never forget. For example, the descriptions of the scenes from the hospitals in Gaza. Now, I don't have time here today to go into the detail, but I will provide this tribunal with the summary document that we published. Now, we did that in spring 2024, and even then, it was obvious that war crimes were being undertaken. And yet the government, then the Conservative government, was claiming there was no evidence of violations of international law. And despite the vast numbers of deaths, they'd undertaken next to no action. So for me, the key point is this. If 2 backbench MPs with their small teams could organise hearings where such evidence was presented, then the British government, with all its vast resources, was clearly and deliberately ignoring evidence of war crimes. It wasn't making the efforts to pursue the truth. It wasn't allocating staff to gather evidence. It was not fulfilling its moral duties. It was not fulfilling its legal duties. In short, it wasn't bothered. And that's an example of what I would label political complicity. We are witnessing a genocide, live streamed in real time, tens of thousands murdered with impunity, children starved, hospitals bombed, war crime after war crime. And some governments, including the UK, are helping to arm Israel, including with the parts for the world's most powerful fighter jets, as we've heard. That's one form of complicity. Complicity through military cooperation, as we've heard detailed. But I would argue that they're also complicit through the political green lights that they give Israel. The government should have been using every single tool at its disposal, from sanctions, which I'll come to using its role in the UN and elsewhere to force, not plead with Israel, to stop. Yet the political complicity, that political complicity has meant it has dragged its feet at every step of the way. It has not properly carried out the assessments needed to fulfil its legal obligations. It's obfuscating the reality, and it has not given MPs straight answers to simple questions. And all this appears to be so that it doesn't have to take the action needed. And this is in stark contrast to what it has done over Russian war crimes. By way of example, in September 2024, the new government suspended some arms export licences, 30 of over 350. While the government still does not give us clarity on what is still being exported, we do know, as we've heard, that F-35 fighter jet parts continue with nothing to stop these indirectly ending up in Israel's hands. What I find extraordinary about this decision is that when it was made in September 2024 by the new Labour government, Israel had already killed 40,000 Palestinians and launched over tens of thousands of airstrikes on Gaza. Yet in its own assessment of international humanitarian law violations from that September, the government had examined just 413 of these individual incidents when making its assessment. And of those, it found only one possible violation of international law. So I want to repeat that. By its international humanitarian law assessment in September 2024, the one that led to it suspending some arms licences, the UK government had found just one possible international humanitarian law violation. Just one. And that's what I mean by political complicity. It's wrong for the government to have assessed so few incidents. It's also wrong to have used the methodology that they used, because the methodology that they used is only assessing incidents individually on a case-by-case basis rather than looking at patterns. For example, the systematic destruction of hospitals or mass population transfers. And I just want to read out the written parliamentary answer I was given in June this year when I asked the government again about this. The response from the minister responsible was as follows, and I quote, "Our international humanitarian law assessments have raised concerns about possible breaches of international humanitarian law in the areas of humanitarian access, the treatment of detainees and forced displacement. We have not been able to reach a determination in relation to the conduct of hostilities due to the lack of sufficient verifiable evidence. To determine a possible breach in this area requires access to sensitive, specific information related to individual incidents such as the intended targets, anticipated military advantage and anticipated civilian harm, which is often not available to us." So the government has not seen anything in the conduct of this war, the bombings, the shootings, the tanks rolling in, that leads it to conclude even possible international humanitarian law violations, and that is because of a lack of information from Israel on why it is conducting these strikes. That's totally perverse. Why are we asking a state whose leader and defence minister were charged with war crimes to provide evidence about strikes that could constitute war crimes? Is the government writing to Vladimir Putin and asking him for information about Russian war crimes before taking action? Of course not. We've had a similar frustration with holding the government to account over genocide. For months, the government claimed it cannot determine whether there is a risk of genocide, as that is a matter for the courts. For example, I recently asked the government whether it had an assessment of whether Israel was in breach of the Genocide Convention. Again, I will read the written parliamentary answer I was recently given, which states, and I quote, "The UK's long-standing policy is that any formal determination as to whether genocide has occurred is a matter for a competent national or international court, rather than for governments or non-judicial bodies. It should be decided after consideration of all the evidence available in the context of a credible judicial process." But that totally undermines the government's duty under the Genocide Act to proactively prevent genocide, because it's the Prevention of Genocide Convention, not the wait till genocide has been completed convention. Now, this is what I mean about the lack of transparency, the failure to do all they can, and what I call political complicity. And finally, I want to look at the issue of double standards. Our government rightly imposed sanctions on Russia, but next to nothing is done about sanctions on Israel. The government says that the UK has sanctioned over 2,500 individuals, entities and ships under the Russia sanctions regime, over 2,300 of which have been sanctioned since Putin's full-scale invasion. In contrast, for Israel, there have been just a handful of sanctions against 2 far-right ministers and against some extremist settlers and settlers' bodies, and only, I believe, for their action in the West Bank, not for the war on Gaza. And in the Foreign Secretary's statement in Parliament on Monday, when we were given the transcript of his statement by the clerks in the House, it refers to, in advocacy of the government's position being sufficient so far, that 3 sanctions have been brought against Israel. It said that there have been 3, and it's totaled them up themselves, and it didn't take long to do so. That's why in November 2024, in line with the ruling of the ICJ, I organised a letter signed by over 60 parliamentarians from 7 parties, calling on the Foreign Secretary to impose widespread sanctions on Israel over its repeated violations of international law. We did not receive any response, so over the summer, I coordinated 85 MPs and Lords from 9 political parties to again make this call for sanctions. The call to suspend the UK-Israel trade agreement until Israel complies with international law, ban all trade in goods and services with illegal Israeli settlements, impose targeted sanctions, including travel bans and asset freezes on all individuals and entities complicit in Israel's occupation, end all arms transfers to Israel, including F-35 components which can be used in violations of international humanitarian law, conduct a full review of UK-Israel relations to ensure no support is given to violations of international law. But as with this tribunal today, I won't be waiting on the government to do the right thing, because it will be through pressure from ordinary people, from campaigners and parliamentarians that we will secure justice. So next week, I'll be launching a new sanctions on Israel bill and forming a new parliamentary working group for sanctions on Israel. Thank you for your time, and I hope that the tribunal has found that presentation useful.
Thank you very much. Do you have questions?
Could I ask a question? First of all, Richard, thank you very much for that very powerful statement you've given and the work you've done in raising particularly the legal issues along with our colleague Imran Hussain, who I'm very pleased to see is here today and has also done a huge amount of work on this particular subject. In your meetings with ministers and civil servants under both governments with the Foreign Office, do you detect they are fully aware of the breaches of international law that appear to be taking place? Or do you feel there is a big cover-up going on and they're fully aware of it and don't want to admit it?
I think it may be the case that ministers have convinced themselves that what they're doing is sufficient. I think it's very notable that over the summer a line has developed. We've been consistently asking in questions in Parliament and in correspondence to ministers, why isn't the government bringing extensive sanctions against Israel in the way it has against Russia? Their original response before the summer parliamentary recess was to not answer the question. They now do have an answer to the question, which is they say, name a developed country that has brought more sanctions against Israel than us, because I find it quite offensive the way they say developed country, because obviously what they're trying to do there is to write out South Africa, Colombia, and other countries in the Hague Group out of the picture. And of course, if these matters end up in court, and if ministers have to end up finding themselves answerable to legal proceedings, then we didn't do sufficient, but neither did some other Western countries. It's not going to be, in my view, a valid defence. It may be that ministers have deluded themselves, but the consistent thing is that we don't get straight answers. Sometimes we don't get answers at all, and where we do get answers, as Katie said earlier, they're not straight answers. Whether that's because the government ministers aren't asking the correct questions at all, or whether that's because things are being deliberately concealed by ministers, I don't know.
Thank you again very much for this really powerful statement. I have a question regarding the legal departments in the government. I mean, in independent lawyers, there's almost wall-to-wall consensus that Israel is egregiously violating international humanitarian law and actually has violated the Genocide Convention. Do you get to see the briefings that the legal departments are giving the politicians? And are these legal briefings indicating that there is no violation and therefore I don't know how they reach such conclusions? Or are these legal briefings kept in the dark and all you get to see is what the ministers are telling you? Because I think it's very important for us to see what the actual experts in the Foreign Office and in the Defense Office are saying.
Now, we don't get to see the legal advice. Many requests have been made for publication of legal advice, and we just don't get that. What we get is answers at the dispatch box from ministers. And something I find very interesting on the question of legal advice and legal conclusions and legal duties is that we can have in the House of Commons a series of statements. We can have where there's a statement on the situation in Gaza, followed by a statement about the situation in Ukraine. And we sometimes have the same minister answering both statements or giving both statements, answering questions from MPs. In the first statement, if it's on Gaza, it's not for us to determine whether or not there are war crimes because it's only for the due legal process and et cetera, it's not possible. And then in the subsequent statements to the House and questions being responded to from the dispatch box, suddenly it can be clearly said that war crimes are taking place, and that Russia has committed war crimes, fine, but that double standard where there can be a clear view on the legal position in relation to one country but not another is another example of what I'd call double standards. And we've pursued publication of the legal advice and we haven't had that. So in that sense, not only is Parliament kept in the dark, but the public is being kept in the dark as well.